Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about the culture of the 1920s, and you can't really talk about the culture without talking about cars or automobiles, so that's kind of what we're going to start off talking about first. Now, automobiles changed America perhaps more than anything else during the 1920s. Cars changed the economy, work habits, and play habits, culture, values, and the American landscape. In 1924, there were over 17 million cars and trucks in America. A decade earlier, the nation had been dominated by kind of a horse culture. In 1909, over 2 million horse-drawn vehicles were made, but by 1923, only 10,000 were made annually. So the 1920s sees a shift from the horse culture to the car culture. Now, the car brought a whole host of changes to America. I've got a whole list here. Freedom of movement and mobility. Houses had to be designed differently now that you needed a garage for your car. Schools became larger and more consolidated because school buses could transport students from all over a county to a new central school. So you could kind of say goodbye to the one-room schoolhouse. Dating became more common and less supervised. American law, taxes, and bureaucracy grew to accommodate the rise in the number of Americans with cars. Cars created a higher demand in industries such as glass, rubber, nickel, steel, machine tools, and gasoline. Construction went up because you needed roads for the cars. More people visited national parks. Billboards, motels, shopping centers, and filling stations, as gas stations were called, popped up all over America. Department stores started to build huge parking lots to accommodate their customers who drove to shop now. And cars became the ultimate status symbol of the 1920s. Think of cars in the 1920s as TVs are in the 1950s and 60s, or the computer and the internet are of the 1990s and 2000s. So cars are a status symbol. Now, you can't talk about cars without talking about Henry Ford. His impact on the car and America was rivaled by almost no one in the 1920s. For example, in 1924, 1 out of every 2 cars was a Model T, his car. He revolutionized the way cars were produced, and he made cars affordable for the masses. Now, Henry Ford grew up on a farm in Michigan. He was born in Dearborn in 1863. He always loved to tinker, even at a young age. He used to take apart the children's Christmas presents, his siblings, and if they got a toy, he would take it apart and tinker with it and try to put it back together. Ford did experience tragedy at a young age. His mother died when he was 13 years old, and this kind of always left a hole in Henry Ford's life. Now, eventually, Henry Ford went to work in Detroit. He completed an apprenticeship with the Dry Dock Engine Company after 3 years. He later went to work for Westinghouse as a repairman. He was basically a wandering mechanic. In 1888, after falling in love with Clara Jane Bryant, he married her. After marriage, he went to work for the Edison Illuminating Company. In 1903, Ford organized the Ford Motor Company, which is the company that he would kind of make famous. Now, just to give you an example of how profitable this company was going to become, in 1903, James Couzens invested $2,500 in the Ford Motor Company to kind of help it get started. When he sold his 11% interest in 1919, so less than 20 years later, he made just under $30 million. So his $2,500 turned into $30 million in just a little over 15 years. Now, the Model T was the most famous car of the 1920s. It was named the Model T because it was the 20th model Ford had designed. It was first introduced in 1908, and production ceased in 1927. So just a little less than 20 years it's produced. Its price was originally $950, but because of Ford's assembly line, the price fell to $350, making it the most affordable car in America. In 1927, the price dropped a little bit more to $290. So basically, Ford makes car ownership available for the masses. That's kind of one of the most important things about him. Now, the joke of the time went with the Model T is that you can have it in any color you want as long as the color is black. The Model T got 25 miles to the gallon, and it could travel at 40 miles an hour. It did not have a speedometer, windshield wipers, or doors. From 1909 to 1910, there were about 20,000 Model Ts produced, and then by 1927, the 15 millionth Model T had been produced. Now, at the Ford Highland Park factory, mass production was first experimented with in the magneto department. That's kind of the electrical parts of the car. The assembly line is what made the Model T so affordable. Ford had studied meatpacking plants, which deassembled the animals, right? They disassemble them. So Ford basically reversed the process for his cars. Before the assembly line, it took about 12 hours to build a car. In 1914, the time dropped to 93 minutes. In 1920, Ford could turn out a car every minute. And then on October 31st, 1925, he built 9,100 cars, or one every 10 seconds. Now, Ford later builds the super plant at the Rogue River. It's called the Ford Rogue River plant. This new plant cost $250 million. He basically shut all his plants down and built this massive new plant so that it could create a new car, the Model A. Now, a lot of times you see people criticize these big businessmen because they have hundreds of millions of dollars, sometimes billions of dollars, and the argument goes, why should anybody need this much money or have this much money? This is kind of what the progressives argue. Well, building these plants cost tons of money, so it's not like they just have that money sitting in the bank and they never use it, and it just sits there, doesn't help anyone, and if the government took it away, then they could use it to help the people. That money sits there because people like Henry Ford know how to use it later on to build better things for America, provide more jobs. Now, the Model A was faster, safer, and better looking than the Model T. It had a self-starter, shifting was easier, it had wind-up windows, it had hydraulic shock absorbers, and most importantly, it came in lots of different colors. Now, its basic price was $495, so it's a little bit more expensive than the Model T. In 1929, Ford sold about 1.5 million cars. One time Henry Ford said of the car, "It will be so low in price that no man making a good salary will be unable to own one and enjoy with his family the blessings of hours of pleasure in God's open spaces." Now, Henry Ford was also famous for how he treated his workers. In 1914, he doubled wages of workers from $2.35 a day to $5 a day, and he reduced the workday from 9 hours to 8 hours. He also is the first big industrialist to give his workers Saturday and Sundays off. So basically, one of the things Henry Ford gave to the nation, and other industrialists follow him, is he doubled wages. He gave an 8-hour workday, and he gave us the weekends off. Part of the reason is doubling wages will make your workers have more money, so the workers turn around and they buy the cars they're producing. So Henry Ford knows if he gives his workers good wages, then he'll sell more cars. And he also knows that you need time off to enjoy the car, so the weekends are a time to enjoy the car. There were other car manufacturers, car industrialists during the early 20th century. Henry Ford wasn't the only famous man. William C. Durant worked for General Motors and Chevrolet. He organized GM in 1908, and it included other car companies such as Buick, Cadillac, Oldsmobile, and Oakland, which is now Pontiac. At GM, Durant's plan was to offer a different car for every different type of consumer. So basically, Ford creates the Model T and the Model A, basically one type of car, everyone gets the same type of car. But Durant knows that some people have more money, so he wants to offer better cars for them. So he offers cheap cars, expensive cars, cars in the middle. Now he's later forced out of GM and he starts Chevrolet. Later in 1916, he came back to GM, although he's forced out later on. GM eventually became a billion-dollar company. It was the second billion-dollar company in the world after U.S. Steel. Now, GM and Durant allowed their cars to be purchased on installment plans. Ford wanted cash for his cars, but allowing people to buy cars on credit means that more people will buy cars. By 1927, 2/3 of America's cars were bought on installment plans. Now, they usually require 25% down, but if you could provide 25% down, you could walk away with a car right now. Alfred P. Sloan, a later another famous car industrialist. He replaced Durant at GM. He infused marketing into selling cars, and he changed how cars were sold. Now, Ford worked, like I said, to build cars that would be for the same type of people. But what another thing that Ford did is he built cars that would last for a long time. Sloan introduced yearly model changes. So every year he tried to introduce a newer, sleeker, shinier model of a car. There's something called planned obsolescence. Basically, after a few years, your car's model would be old and out of style, and it would be time to get a new model. So it's kind of a way to appeal to consumerism. You know, you need a new car. Yeah, your old car's running fine, but this new one looks better. It's a better status symbol, so you kind of need to get it. The other most important car company in America was Chrysler. So Ford, GM, and Chrysler are kind of the big three automakers. Walter P. Chrysler starts the company. One of the things Chrysler is most famous for is the Chrysler Building in Manhattan. It was the tallest building in the world up to that time. Now, we kind of talked about the politics of the 20s. We call the 20s the Roaring 20s because of all the prosperity and the consumption. But there is kind of this cultural tug of war between the rural and the urban areas of the country. Something very important happens in 1920. For the first time, according to the 1920s census, more people live in towns and cities than don't. So a town is considered 2,500 people, so that's still pretty small. But in 1920, more people live in towns of 2,500 or more than don't. Now, America is still very rural. Don't think that everyone's in the big city. About a third of workers are still farmers or work on farms. And in 1930, 44% of the nation is still rural. And to a lot of people, a town of 2,500 or 5,000, they still think that that's rural, even if it's considered a city. But these changes that are occurring, in many ways, the 1920s will be a decade of constant struggle between the city and the countryside for control of America's heart and soul. Sinclair Lewis is an author, an American writer, and he kind of exemplifies this. He writes a book in 1920 called Main Street, and he basically talks about America's small town. He's critical of small town America. His book is kind of a work of satire. The journalist William Allen White ends up writing something to challenge him called The Other Side of Main Street. William Allen White says, "Small towns are the utopia of the American dream. There are rich and poor in small towns, but great wealth is as unusual as bitter poverty. Death, poverty, grief, tragedy visit the city, and no friends hurry to heal the wounds. But goodwill in the American country town is institutionalized. In some organized way, the town's goodwill touches every family. Men feel the strength of it, take courage from it, give themselves to it, and they grow in stature by what they give." So there's kind of intellectual arguments about our towns or the rural places better. America is becoming more homogenous thanks to national advertising, standardized products, radio, magazines, and newspapers. Now, for farmers, the 1920s are not a good decade. Farmers really struggle during this era. They kind of struggle in the post-World War I world. A lot of Americans are farmers. Farming boomed during World War I. Farmers went into debt to buy more land and equipment because Europe is killing itself. Nobody's farming over there, so we provide the food for the world. But after World War I, farmers in America face a downturn because Europe gets back to farming. So there's a rural depression for much of the 1920s. Workers, on the other hand, have a pretty good decade in the 1920s. For them, the decade is one of increasing wages and lower consumer prices. So this is kind of why we call the 20s the Roaring 20s, because of how well the economy did. Now, the 1920s has a lot of new technologies and consumerism. During the 1920s, Americans produced and purchased cars, radios, and home appliances. They went to the movies and they bought books in record numbers. More people had access to electricity in the 1920s. In 1912, only about 16% of American households had electricity, but in 1920, that number had jumped to 63% of American households. People had more time and more money to buy things. This did change the culture of America. Previous values of thrift and restraint were being replaced by installment purchases and instant gratification. Things like cars, radios, appliances were bought on credit. Something like 80% of the radios during the 1920s were bought on credit, and 60% of the cars. Cars would advertise ride now, pay later. As a result, consumer debt skyrockets during the 20s. Consumer debt reached $3 billion in 1927. Advertising also jumps up during the 1920s. $4 billion was spent annually on advertising. Bruce Barton, he wrote a book called The Man Nobody Knows. It was a book about Jesus kind of recast as a businessman, and the disciples were his kind of businessmen that he hired to kind of help him spread his message. So it's kind of like a reinterpretation of Jesus's life. He said this about advertising: the goal of advertising is to, quote, arouse desires and stimulate wants, to make people dissatisfied with the old and out of date, and by constant iteration to send them to work harder to get the latest model, whether that be an icebox or a rug or a new home. There's also a lot of new inventions in the 1920s for Americans to consume. This is just kind of a random list, but you have Scotch tape, Welch's grape juice, hair color rinse, Kleenex, Listerine, and the popsicle. Frank Epperson, he's the one that invented the popsicle. He was a lemonade salesman. He accidentally left a glass of lemonade with a spoon in it outside on the windowsill, and it froze overnight, and the next day he saw it and he pulled the spoon out and he got the idea for the popsicle. The electric razor and the zipper were also invented in the 1920s. Wheaties became the breakfast of champions in 1924. There's lots of interesting fads during the 1920s. The Chinese game Mahjong became very popular. Egyptian clothing and decorations were very popular for the rich. Marathon dancing became a thing. The record was set in April 1923 when one couple danced for 39 hours. Flagpole sitting was probably the craziest fad of the 1920s. Alvin Kelly started this craze in 1924. He sat atop the roof of a Los Angeles hotel and stayed up there for over 13 hours on a flagpole with a little perch on it. By the time he quit sitting on flagpoles, he claimed to have spent over 20,000 hours atop of flagpoles, kind of at the end of his career. Flagpoles popped up all over the country. Young people started doing this. Some towns started to institute building codes for flagpoles, and they had to be inspected by the city to make sure they were safe. Crossword puzzles became popular in the 1920s. Massive crossword puzzle books started to be sold, and they each came with a sharpened pencil. There's also a lot of notorious crime during the 1920s. Charles Ponzi was an Italian immigrant with a criminal history that included forgery. Ponzi came up with the idea of selling promissory notes that would pay back a 50% dividend. So basically, if you gave him $10, he would give you back 15. He said that he could do this by taking advantage of differences in foreign exchange rates, and he opened up an investment business. Now, he started out small, but by 1920, he was taking $1 million a week from investors. It seemed that everyone was investing in Ponzi's scheme. His plan worked because he always used new investors to pay off old investors. So as long as new people kept joining, his strategy worked. But eventually the authorities and journalists figured out that he couldn't really be making money off of his investments, and people quit giving him money, and it all came crashing down. Only about $200,000 was recovered out of the $15 million he swindled people out of. He was convicted of mail fraud and sentenced to prison. He was released in 1934 and deported to Italy. In 1927, a New York housewife named Ruth Snyder convinced her lover, Henry Jude Gray, to help her kill her husband. Ruth took her husband to a card game one night and got him drunk. When they came home, her lover was waiting in the house. She waited till her husband went to bed, and then her lover started to strangle him. He struggled. She hit him on the head with an object and knocked him out, and then they gave him chloroform and killed him. She took out an insurance policy, so she was trying to make a lot of money off of this, but their stories quickly fell apart. They didn't really make any sense. Both were executed in the electric chair, but what kind of made this murder so famous is that Ruth Snyder's execution was caught in a picture. One of the witnesses of the execution he snuck in a camera on his leg and he took a picture of her execution mid-execution. So this picture kind of shows that. This picture was put on the front page of the Daily News, so it was kind of shocking because it was a murder of a husband by his wife, but then her execution was also caught in a photograph. The Bobby Franks killing in 1924 and the subsequent Leopold Loeb case gripped the nation. So Bobby Franks is this 14-year-old boy who one day goes home from school and is kidnapped and is never heard from again. His parents waited and waited, and finally they receive a ransom note demanding $10,000. As efforts are being made to deliver the ransom, the body of a naked and mutilated boy was found, and it turned out that that was the missing boy, Bobby Franks. It turned out that Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb had committed a thrill kill. The two were from very well-off families. They were both graduate students at the University of Chicago. Loeb had an IQ of 160 and Leopold had one of 210. The two had kidnapped Bobby in their car, bludgeoned him with a steel chisel, gagged him and suffocated him. They poured hydrochloric acid all over his body and dumped his body into a culvert. Leopold later said that he had no more feeling than, quote, an entomologist impaling a beetle on a pin. He said that about killing Bobby. The two would have gotten the death penalty, but the famed defense attorney Clarence Darrow argued a Freudian defense. He basically told the judge that the boys were victims of their subconscious. They were guilty of the murder, but they should be imprisoned for life and not executed, because their subconscious kind of drove them to this, and that's what happened. They were sentenced to life in prison. Loeb was killed in prison, but Leopold was let out in 1958. There's another famous murder case called the Sacco and Vanzetti case. Sacco and Vanzetti were Italian immigrants to America, but they were anarchists, so they were radicalized immigrants. They were charged with the murder of a paymaster and a guard during a $15,000 payroll robbery. Now, we don't really know if they committed the murder. The trial was kind of unfair because they were anarchists and radicals. Now, they might have done the killing, but we're not really sure. Both men are found guilty and sentenced to death. There's basically a 7-year effort to save them. Even Benito Mussolini, the dictator of Italy, asked the governor of Massachusetts to halt their execution, but this doesn't work. They are executed in August of 1927. Probably the most famous criminal of the 1920s was Al Capone. Now remember, the 18th Amendment forbids the manufacture, distribution, and sale of alcohol, and the Volstead Act enforces that law. Now, enforcement of prohibition is very difficult. There was something like 8,700 miles of border of the United States, both land and water, and the authorities have to keep alcohol out of the United States. With Coolidge prosperity reigning, more and more people had money to buy alcohol. Now, most Americans didn't go to speakeasies, which were these secret saloons where alcohol was served. Most Americans didn't drink, but if they did, they made alcohol in their own homes and they consumed it in their own homes. So most Americans that drink aren't going to get arrested for it. But with that said, Americans did want to drink, and there were tens of thousands of speakeasies throughout the United States. Bootlegging was basically the business of providing alcohol to consumers. It was a $2 billion a year industry, $2 billion a year. Now, Al Capone was born in Brooklyn in 1899 to immigrant parents. He had a troubled childhood. He often ran with street gangs of young boys. He was expelled from school at one point because he hit a female teacher who had hit him after he had misbehaved. Capone worked a series of odd jobs, including times as a bouncer. In 1919, Capone married May Coughlin, and the two had a son together. In 1919, he also moved from Brooklyn to Chicago to take a job with organized crime. Now, there's a lot of turf wars and killings in Chicago, but eventually Capone rose to the top of the Chicago organized crime. Capone could be both cold-blooded and kind. He's kind of a weird character. He once had a reporter beat up who was writing critical stories about him, but then he paid the hospital bill for the reporter. Another time there was an assassination attempt against him and his offices were shot up by machine guns. He paid the hospital bills for those who were injured in the crossfire, and he also paid the fees for repairing the buildings that were damaged by the bullets. So in a sense, he kind of sees himself as somebody who takes care of the community around him, but he's also very brutal and cold-blooded. Once, when 3 of his own men were stealing from him, they were stealing shipments of alcohol off the side. He found out about this and invited them to a fancy dinner. He ate with them, joked with them, but then at the end of the dinner, he had them tied to their chairs, and one by one, he walked behind them and beat them to death with a baseball bat. So imagine that you're sitting at dinner and then all of a sudden you're rushed by the bodyguards, you're tied up in a chair, and Al Capone beats the first guy to death, then he walks behind you and he beats you to death, and then he walks to the next guy and does the same thing. So he's a very cruel person in some ways. His biggest shock crime, though, was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. This occurred on February 14th, 1929. A car that looked like what police would drive pulled up to a rival gang's garage. 5 men got out of the car, 3 in police uniforms. They pretended to raid the rival gang's garage, took their weapons, and then put them up against the wall and machine gunned them to death. Some of the men were finished off with a shotgun blast to the head. Then the 3 policemen walked back to their cars looking like they arrested the 2 plainclothes men. So nobody knew that this was a massacre at first, but later the bodies were found. Now, despite all his proclivities for violence, Capone operated his crime organization like a business, and he knew that turf wars were bad for business. Instead, he preferred to divide up Chicago so that everyone had their place. He was more interested in doing business than killing rival gangsters. Now, a few things brought Al Capone down. In May 1927, there was this really weird Supreme Court case. The court ruled that a bootlegger named Manny Sullivan had to report his illegal earnings and pay taxes on them. So he's a bootlegger and he makes a living bootlegging, which is illegal, but the Supreme Court says you have to pay taxes on that. This ends up giving the IRS a way to look at Capone's lavish spending and lifestyle and compare that with his tax returns. In addition, a young prohibition agent named Elliot Ness puts together a team of agents known as the Untouchables that went after Capone's network. They raided his warehouses and confiscated his alcohol. Soon, many people were looking elsewhere to purchase alcohol for their speakeasies. This drove down Capone's business. And finally, the government went after Capone for tax evasion, and that's what brings him down. In 1931, a federal prosecutor announced that a grand jury had indicted Capone on 22 counts of income tax evasion and some 5,000 Volstead Act violations. Capone planned to plead guilty and receive a light sentence, but the judge, James Wilkerson, said that if he pleaded guilty, he would give him the full sentence. So Capone pleads innocent, and he thinks he buys off the jury, but the judge dismisses the jury and makes a new jury of rural voters in Illinois, not just from Chicago. So Capone can't get to these rural juries, and he's ended up found guilty and sentenced to 11 years in prison. He does time in Atlanta and then later Alcatraz. He was released in 1939 and he died in Florida in 1947.